All right, it's betting time. I'm going to make a bet that you likely were not surprised to hear that this week Donald Trump's net approval rating hit another all-time low. Donald Trump is currently 25 points underwater, according to the Economist tracker of YouGov polling. Much of that discontent among American voters has to do with Donald Trump's war of choice with Iran, which has sent prices soaring and further destabilized an already volatile part of the world. We still don't know whether Trump will restart this war. It's in a ceasefire in theory right now. But one of the things we do know is that some congressional Republicans are finally waking up to the reality that voters really don't like what they see. Yesterday, House Democrats finally passed a war powers resolution to end Donald Trump's war with Iran with the help of 4 Republicans, despite House Speaker Mike Johnson's repeated efforts to stifle that vote. But this isn't the only vote that Republicans broke with Trump on this week. Tonight, 18 Republicans joined House Democrats to pass a bill that would send additional military aid to Ukraine. So joining me to talk about this is the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Democratic Congressman Gregory Meeks. Congressman, nice to see you.
Good to see you.
I invited you on the show because I keep running into you in the streets of New York, so I thought I was going to be here with you in person. Let me talk about Ukraine. There was a moment, and this was before Donald Trump, there was a moment when support for Ukraine had all but 1 vote in the United States Congress. This was about as bipartisan an issue as you can get. And it sort of eroded under Donald Trump and his sort of way of looking at Ukraine and telling them they don't have all the cards and trying to cut deals and saying he could end the war on day one. What's happened? I mean, you finally got 18 Republicans to vote with you, but what's happened that Democrats have to lead this charge to protect an allied country against an adversary?
Because the Republican Party has become the party of Trump. It's no longer the Republican Party by and large, or overwhelmingly. It's the party of Donald Trump. And we see Donald Trump tries to take retribution on various members when they do not do what he asked them to do. We see that continuously. You know, he still have his way of being vindictive in that regards. So it did take some brave Republicans to stand up to finally pass this vote with reference to Ukraine. You know, I also think that Donald Trump has this unique relationship with dictators, particularly Vladimir Putin. We've seen that from the first Trump administration, where he was accepting Putin's and Russia's intelligence over the United States intelligence.
Yep.
We've seen that where he has treated Putin, welcomed him in Alaska on red carpet, and berated Zelensky in the White House. We've seen it when he says Putin should do anything he wants, and we've seen it when he said that Ukraine doesn't have the cards. Well, Ukraine has been stepping up themselves with their own ingenuity, and the European countries have been stepping up. And though Putin continues to bomb, they in Ukraine are fighting back. And if we just do our part, they can win, which will shorten this war, which will help bring prices down for here in America also.
Yeah. Let's talk about the other war. Somebody asked me last night, what does this mean? What does it mean that they passed a war powers resolution? Does that do anything? Because Donald Trump said doesn't mean anything to him.
Well, Donald Trump doesn't like to abide by the law, we know. But it is a privileged resolution, which means it can be brought up automatically in the Senate, but I'm going to let the Senate decide that. And we want to try to get the Senate to pass the same resolution, because once we pass that, then it's a concurrent resolution, which does not go to the president. He cannot veto it. It becomes the law. That's based upon the War Powers Act, where the equal but separate branch of government, the only branch of government that is given the right by the Constitution to declare war. And so this is a step in the direction of allowing the American people's voices to be heard, because they know that Donald Trump's war of choice is costing them at the gas pump, it's costing them at the grocery stores, it's costing them in deaths of our soldiers and putting them in the way, and it's not going to close the Strait of Hormuz. So the war has to stop. So this is the first step. And we've got to continue to move forward so that Donald Trump cannot continue his war of choice where he had no plan, no talking about ending, did not work with any of our allies or our friends. That's why they're not there now. And we're going to have can't bomb our way out. So he's put us in a weaker position, even as far as negotiations are concerned. And remember, he's the one that ripped up the JCPOA that Barack Obama had put in. And now
he's dealing with all the things that he wanted dealt with. It actually had all the answers that he wanted dealt with. Congressman, nice to see you. Thanks for joining us. Congressman Gregory
Good to be with you.
How do you define ceasefire?
Pretty much the way it is. It's a different part of the world. I'd say in that part of the world, ceasefire is when you're shooting in a more moderate manner.
Mr. President, yesterday you signed, Mr. President.
Not bad. That's true. I mean, a ceasefire there is much different than a ceasefire in other parts of the world.
So, Katty K, we have a new definition of ceasefire. It's when there's shooting only in a moderate manner, defined by the president himself, when you're not bringing out the big guns, I guess. Of course, this ceasefire that has been in place, we've called it shaky, we've called it fragile. I mean, there are shots, there are live rounds being fired, for the most part, from Iran at our allies across the Gulf states. So what is the state, from your reporting, of these negotiations such that they are to end this war?
Yeah, I suspect if you're sitting in Kuwait this morning, you're not thinking that there is much of a ceasefire going on. Every time I've spoken to leaders and ministers in the Gulf region, they do remind me that they are still under attack, and this ceasefire is a ceasefire in name pretty much only. But it is not full-scale war, and the question is, are we any closer to getting some kind of a deal? After all of the fits and starts that we've had out of the White House, it seems the two big issues that remain are whether the Iranians will have any kind of control of the Strait of Hormuz, and the even bigger issue is what's to be done about Iran's nuclear program. Willie, it still looks like we're at the status quo ante, where before the shooting started on February the 28th, Iran had a nuclear program. It didn't control the Strait of Hormuz, and I think at the moment that's the best that the administration can hope for. Donald Trump seems to be terrified of the O word, the Obama word, anything being compared that he does to the JCPOA, which may be why there's a holdup. It looks like they had got fairly close, but then he got spooked by being criticized for being weak and that this looked too much like the original Iran deal. One member of Congress had told me that the one thing he really doesn't want is pallets of cash going over to the Iranians, and the deal that we were doing looked like there was some kind of cash component to it. So, who knows where we are? Who knows how close we are? Who knows if they can square these circles? One thing I will say is most of the Iran experts I have spoken to don't set much store by whatever Iran signs when it comes to their nuclear program.
Yeah, I will say a Middle East expert told me yesterday that, frankly, President Trump's definition of a ceasefire for that part of the world, not that far off. So, Richard, let's talk about where things stand. Part of the obstacles, as Katty just said, is President Trump's real hesitation to sign on any sort of agreement that could be remotely compared to what Obama did a decade or so ago. The worried about the cash, worried about JCPOA comparisons, and also his instinct. He knows this war has not gone well. And I have some reporting out in the Atlantic in a brand new story about his impulse. Every time we've gotten close, he tries to make the deal bigger so he can try to sell it as a grand bargain. And there's a really interesting, telling scene in the story about that phone call he had over the weekend, or 10 days ago or so, with some leaders urging them to join the Abraham Accords. Yep. And he was met with such silence, literal silence on the phone, that the President of the United States had to say, "Hi, is anybody there?" He thought the connection dropped because there was such a reluctance for people to do that because of their feelings about Israel right now, et cetera, et cetera. So with that as the backdrop and the violence picking up again this week, what is your sense? What could be a realistic next step to get us a little closer to an agreement? Is there one?
No, it's the same set of issues. And the president balked, as you say, at the deal the other day because he was worried about the criticism he was getting from Republicans for the first time. But there's not going to be a better deal. The idea that you're going to get something happening at the negotiating table that's not going to reflect what's happening on the ground just doesn't happen. That's just not going to happen. The Iranians also, they see the vote in the Congress and all that. Everything they're seeing suggests to them that time is on their side, that they have more endurance, if you will, than we do. So we'll ultimately get there, but it's going to be a very messy situation on the Strait. And even if we get it reopened, No one should think for a second it's going to stay reopened without conditions. The nuclear, at best, you'll get something almost as a prelude to a second JCPOA, some type of a framework deal that places ceilings on Iran's nuclear activities, won't limit them. And then going back to the Lebanon part of the story, you're not going to get a deal that's going to handle lots of the other issues, ballistic missiles, drones, air forces, navies, mining, not to mention support for proxy groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. So this is going to be a very limited agreement at best. And my guess is we'll get there sooner or later. But almost going back to the president's point, it won't be peace. Whatever else we're going to get, it will not be peace. It will be intermittent ceasefires.
So, Richard, what happens now that Iran, on an almost daily basis, is lobbing missiles or drones at various neighboring countries? What happens if one of those missiles, one of those drones, lands, explodes, and a member of the American personnel over there, army, whatever, gets killed?
There's two big triggers here. That's one, where for the president, that might put him under enormous pressure to respond. So that's one where then we would have to attack something with escalate there. The most likely set of targets that we haven't escalated against, the Israelis did once, are the Iranian energy infrastructure. And the reason we haven't done that, Mike, is we don't want the Iranians going full force against the Kuwaiti, Saudi, UAE, Bahraini, Qatari energy infrastructure, because that would take a crisis into a global calamity. But that's the danger right now, that until this is somewhat more nailed down, whether it's intentional or unintentional, I am worried whether it's a scenario like you just suggested, an American soldier gets killed, or some missile hits some new oil refinery, then there's pressure to retaliate against Iran, and Iran then escalates. That's why it's important, that we get to some type of closer to a ceasefire than we are now. Again, we're never going to get to peace. But can we get something more essentially calmer, where the military dimension of this is tamped way down?
Richard mentioned the House yesterday passing a Democratic-led measure to limit President Trump's war powers when it comes to Iran. The resolution passed 215 to 208 with 4 Republicans, Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, the outgoing Thomas Massie of Kentucky, Tom Barrett of Michigan, and Warren Davidson of Ohio, crossing party lines and joining all Democrats in voting yes. The legislation requires the president to withdraw U.S. forces from hostilities with Iran or to gain approval from Congress to continue the war. That now heads to the Senate, but even if it were to pass both chambers, it faces headwinds and legal questions, standing for now perhaps as just a symbolic blow to President Trump. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Marco Rubio was back on Capitol Hill yesterday, testifying in front of the House Foreign Affairs Committee this time. In an appearance with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee the day before, Secretary Rubio notably said the war is over. Yesterday, he was pressed on that comment. Here first is what he told the Senate on Tuesday, followed by yesterday's exchange with a member of the House.
Rubio, you keep telling us how we're winning this war. The president keeps saying,
well, the war is over.
Completely annihilated. The war is not over. And yet the American people see how we're losing at the pump and with their costs. And yet this thing still hasn't been resolved. Every day he tweets out, oh, we've obliterated them. We've annihilated them. They're going to surrender. But yet we still find ourselves spending billions of dollars a week.
If the war is over, I have a simple question. Who won?
First of all, Epic Fury is over, which is what you would consider the war. That operation is
So you agree
concluded.
it's a war, then?
No, those are hostilities. They called it a war.
Okay.
I'm just responding to the Senator
Mr. Secretary, you can change the name of the operation. It doesn't change the fact that the Strait is still closed and my service members and all of our service members are still in harm's way. The war is not over.
So, Ali, Secretary Rubio trying to do a little cleanup, perhaps, me adding a little caveat to what he had said the day before when he clearly said the war is over, say, no, it's hostilities and Epic Fury is over. Maybe a little semantic game there. But clearly they're struggling to answer the question of where this war stands, where it's going, and why they don't have congressional approval, going back to that previous vote I just talked about, for the war.
Yeah, and even Republicans who are supportive of the administration's efforts in Iran have never said that the war is over at this point. So Rubio was out ahead even of them. And look, it's a cheeky question from Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs of California there, trying to build on what the Secretary of State maybe misspoke about or just simply said incorrectly to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But I think Rubio's job on Capitol Hill was just to simply give updates that don't get ahead of the president and still try to paint a somewhat optimistic picture of what this Iran war has accomplished. And one of the things that I thought Democrats were quite deft at doing yesterday was being able to establish the fact that solving for a closed Strait of Hormuz doesn't solve for a problem that existed prior to the war, causing it as a problem. And I think that's one of the things that they're trying to focus on, as we are also starting to see now with this war powers resolution, which I think you're right to point out is likely just a messaging exercise. And we'll see what it looks like in the Senate if they take it up. There have been some shifting votes, questions about if this so-called YOLO caucus actually leads to the votes that they would need to pass a resolution like this. But at the same time, it's a messaging exercise, I think, largely because the president could veto it. And then there are legal questions about if it actually has teeth in reining in the administration. But I think what it does do is actually give us the first tangible sign that the Republican hand-wringing that I and you and all of us have heard behind the scenes about the political and domestic impacts of the Iran war, that those are actually starting to manifest now for elected officials who weren't given a chance to vote for it, but are now potentially trying to give themselves an opportunity to say, all right, we got to rein this in if it's going to continue.
Congress at least trying to assert its power to support or not the president going to war.
Let's get into it with former spokesperson for the U.S. mission to the United Nations, Hagar Shamali. She also worked at the NSC and the Treasury Department. You're a Lebanon expert, so the perfect person to help us sort of dissect what's happening here, because it sounds like there is some progress, and yet the president is saying that we could see something as soon as this weekend, potentially. 2 weekends ago, it seemed like a deal was imminent, and then he didn't sign off on it. So what's your actual reading of the tea leaves here between all of these various parts of the conflict that we're following?
Yes, a lot of moving parts. Yeah. So on Iran, what I'm hearing is that the two sides are very far apart still. And this is a deal that's really only focused still on the Strait of Hormuz, because Trump is facing a lot of pressure, giving rising gas prices in the pending midterm elections. What happened earlier this week, you have two things that really kind of blew things up for us. No pun intended. Yeah. You had Prime Minister Netanyahu on Sunday threatened to strike Beirut. Yep. The Iranian regime on Monday said talks are off unless there's a ceasefire in Lebanon. And because Trump wants this deal, and he's showing his cards that he very much wants a deal.
While also saying, I don't care.
Right, yeah. Saying he's bored with it. Frankly, I'm getting bored with it, too. It's been 60 days with this ceasefire. And so he, because of that, though, because he does want a deal, he said, OK, fine, I'm going to make that happen. And then puts out a tweet saying that Israel and Hezbollah are going to stop shooting each other, and that he has spoken to a highly placed representative of Hezbollah, which upended a few things for those of us working on peace efforts, because it was selling Lebanon to Iran, and it now established that suddenly we talk to Hezbollah, a terrorist organization that has so much American blood on its hands. But then when you had the peace talks take place this week, just between Israel and Lebanon, though we have some glimmers of hope there. On Iran, I don't see much movement. I will tell you, though, that we have been now in the ceasefire situation longer than we've been in the war part of the ceasefire. Mm-hmm. And those high gas prices are not going anywhere unless Trump makes a decisive move of some kind.
And then when you take in totality that landscape paired with now this new rebuke on Capitol Hill, which frankly had been brewing for the last 2 weeks, it feels to me like it's the earliest indicator of Republican angst around this conflict for the economic and political reasons that you point out. And yet, when you apply what happened in Congress to diplomatic efforts, does it make any motions? Does it have any ripple effects?
Well, this move related to the War Powers Act won't. Yeah. It's symbolic, if anything. It's not going to pass the Senate, number one. And number two, even if it were to pass the Senate, you have some real constitutional issues there. I mean, there are absolutely lawyers that would go get it stuck in some kind of litigation or appeals to the Supreme Court, at least. And they would be fair in requesting that, by the way, because the Constitution is quite clear in the type of war authorities it gives to the commander-in-chief. And so I don't see I don't see anybody in Washington also taken by the vote. In my view, I saw the vote. What fascinated me were the numbers related to that vote. It had a lot of people And it is really reflecting this pressure that Republicans are feeling.
Whereas when you talk about the politics of this foreign policy moment, I had Democrats immediately text me after that vote and say, wow, there was a lot of Republicans that voted for Trump's war in Iran, effectively saying that if they're not voting to hem him in, they're going to try to tag them with being supporters of a conflict that is spiking American gas prices and having ripple effects throughout other sectors of the U.S. economy. That's where the politics has always been intertwined with this, and certainly that's the space between where you and I live. But then, of course, there was Secretary of State Marco Rubio this week, who was really the chief messenger around and on behalf of the war efforts on the Hill this week. He spent nearly 4 hours before the House Foreign Affairs Committee yesterday, facing sharp questions about the consequences of the Iran war and whether the administration fully weighed the risks. Rubio was also put on the defensive after Democrats challenged him over videos they say show President Trump sleeping during cabinet meetings. Watch that.
Did you warn President Trump before the Iran war began that this conflict would drive up costs on gas, food, travel, and
the president,
yes or no?
The president and the full administration was aware that there would be consequences to action, but the consequences of Iran having a nuclear weapon were worse.
Did you warn him? Did you warn him that launching a war on Iran could result in the regime placing a chokehold on the Strait of Hormuz?
All the risk factors were understood, but the most important risk factor was Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon.
Did you warn him? If you did warn him, say yes.
If the war is over, I have a simple question. Who won?
First of all, epic fury is over, which is what you would consider the war. That operation is
So you
concluded.
agree it's a war, then?
No, those are hostilities. They called it a war. Okay. I'm just responding to the Senator.
Mr. Secretary, you can change the name of the operation. It doesn't change the fact that the strait is still closed and my service members and all of our service members are still in harm's way. The war is not over.
You've been at more than one meeting where President Trump has fallen asleep.
That's false. That's false. I've never seen him fall asleep. On the contrary, the guy doesn't sleep, which is a big problem because he calls me at 2 in the morning. He calls me at 5 in the morning. And, I like to sleep a little bit, maybe not 12 hours, but at least 6. So he works. The other day he was at the Oval Office until 12:30 p.m. 12:30 a.m. I don't know what you're talking about.
Secretary Rubio, I'm going to show you in a moment a video that shows you just lied to Congress.
Oh, okay.
So this is a video of a cabinet meeting literally from last month where Donald Trump is sleeping while you're talking. Please show this video.
A coalition of countries that line up behind the peace deal, behind the border peace, and it's still every day is a challenge. But it's been driven personally by the president. It's the reason why we're involved in this whole Ukraine-Russia conflict. That's not our war. It's not the president's war. This war started. It never would have happened if you'd been president. But this war is going on, and the president is trying to end it.
You are literally talking about issues of war and peace, and Donald Trump is sleeping right next to you.
I watched and listened to most of the 4 hours of this from outside of the room yesterday in the hall, and I think it was a lot of fiery moments from Democrats, Republicans really continuing to show that they want to give this administration leeway to deal with Iran. But what jumped out to you? I mean, to me, the fact that Rubio came out and said the day before, the war is over, to Senator Booker, that felt to me like something the administration needs to say if they want to continue making the war powers argument that they've been making. But I wonder what stood out to you.
Well, it's the part that's difficult. First of all, that was quite painful. And by the way, I have worked in Washington for a long time, and I have seen leaders fall asleep at the table of all parties. It happens. It doesn't discriminate against party. So Representative Lieu, I'm sure he's fallen asleep in his own meetings. But I will say that, again, we have been, there was a ceasefire brokered on April 8th. And so we've now been in that time period for longer than we were in epic fury, I guess, in the operations. Mm-hmm. It's still, whether we get into the semantics of war or not war, it doesn't matter. The problem is we're facing this instability in the region. They're still striking partners in the Gulf, the Iranian regime. And on our end, I don't believe President Trump has enough leeway to finish the job. And I personally believe he has to finish the job. Vice President Vance said this at the very beginning, he wasn't in favor of the war, but he said, if you're going to go in, you have to finish the job. And the reason is because you're not negotiating with the government. You're negotiating with a terrorist organization. And the longer this weird middle ground stays, the more things are going to be unstable, the more that has an impact in the Gulf as well in particular and on our gas prices.
I think the bigger question is, what does it look like to finish the job? And what does that require on the part of U.S. troops and the president?
Yeah, it requires a bigger investment, unfortunately. Both kinetic action in Iran of whatever targets might be remaining, but it takes greater military presence in the Strait of Hormuz to really push the Iranians back, to make sure it remains open, and probably, by the way, more partnerships with our allies.
And that is also why I think there is being made a distinction on the semantics of, are we in an active war? Is it over? Is it not? Because many in Congress feel, and this is on both sides, that if it does require more investment and more American treasure, they would like to have a say in doing that push, that next move.